Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and get started now that y'all can actually hear me. So this meeting is about CWD and kind of some updates. And luckily, Rachel came in to the rescue for me kind of last minute. I had everything kind of lined up, and when you do extension programs, things change quickly. So I'm going to allow her to give her presentation. This is recorded, so if there's anything that you see, you can always go back. Fingers crossed, this is our first one. That I'm going to put this on the midland.agrilife.org website and the ector.agrilife.org website as well. This is something that I plan on being a quarterly update event. So if there's any topics that you have that you would like people to address, I would love for y'all to email me, and all that information, all my contact information, and to sign up for my newsletter is on both of those websites, midland.agrilife.org and ector.agrilife.org. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and we will have a session at the end that everyone can unmute if they have any specific questions as well.
Awesome. So hi, everybody. My name is Rachael Connally, and I'm a natural resource specialist out here in Presidio County. So I'm a little bit farther out from the Permian Basin, but I am pretty well involved with chronic wasting disease. So I have some information to share with you on that today. All right, so let's get into it. This presentation is just basically going to be chronic wasting disease 101. And we'll talk about some information for landowners, hunters, and land managers, and anybody else who'd like to be knowledgeable about the disease and learn how they can help out Parks and Wildlife in disease management. So there we go. So first we need to know what exactly is chronic wasting disease. So chronic wasting disease is a neurological disease that's prevalent in some cervid species. Species like white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, red deer, sika, moose, reindeer, and muntjac are all susceptible to chronic wasting disease. Chronic wasting disease is what we call a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, and it's called TSE for short. And there are different types of TSEs that affect different types of species. So scrapie is a TSE that occurs in sheep. BSE, or mad cow disease, is a TSE that occurs in bovines. Kuru actually occurs in humans, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease and variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease are prion diseases that affect humans. So basically, TSEs are caused by prions. A prion is actually a naturally occurring protein structure in all mammals. However, it's a misfolded prion is the root cause of all TSE diseases. Essentially, these prions exist normally in the animal kingdom, and they can be found at greater concentrations in the neural tissue. So like your brain, your spinal column, and things like that. So in their normal structure, these prion proteins are hypothesized to serve unique functions such as ion homeostasis, cell signaling, and neuron protection. But an abnormal prion infects the host by promoting the conversion of normal cellular proteins into an abnormal shape. So essentially, if this is what your normal prion protein looks like, and your dysfunctional prion protein looks like this, the misfolded protein can cause your normal prions to misfold, kind of like a chain reaction, like dominoes. And the replication of these misfolded proteins in the brain creates tiny bubbles that lead to formation of small holes resembling a sponge, giving the S in spongiform to TSE. And this leads to the gradual decline in cognitive abilities and motor function, eventually leading to death. So if we think about this in terms of slinkies, right? You have a perfectly functional slinky that's in its normal shape that you can push down the stairs and it's going to do something productive. But if you have a misfolded protein, it's not going to be able to perform that function. It's not going to be able to move, down the stairs in the way that it was meant to. So transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, including chronic wasting disease, are 100% fatal. So we have no way to treat chronic wasting disease in these deer. And further, there's no effective treatment or cure. So next, we'll look at the progression of chronic wasting disease and prion diseases in mammals. So as I mentioned earlier, if you've got your misfolded prion right there and it comes in contact with a normal prion, it's actually able to alter a normal prion, and then you now have two misfolded prions. So if those two misfolded prions come into contact with two more normal prions, now you're going to have four misfolded prions, and so on and so forth. So essentially, they can replicate this misfolded pattern exponentially. So you actually can see large portions of prions that are degraded, and we call these prion plaques. And these lead to, again, neuron degradation, which ultimately is going to lead to death. So if the animal dies from something before it dies from actually having chronic wasting disease, it typically, it's inevitable that the animal is going to die either from some type of natural cause or chronic wasting disease after it's contracted this disease. And we'll talk more about that in later slides. So here is some images for you of normal brain tissue. You can see here that it's relatively uniform. You don't see a lot of holes in that tissue. That's going to be the picture there on the left. And then the picture on the right is the spongiform pathology. So this is from an infected brain. And you can see kind of what we mean there by those prion plaques, those large areas of white bubbles where there's misfolded proteins that have failed to come together with the normally folded proteins. So obviously, if you have large, white spaces and holes in your neural tissues, you're going to have a very hard time performing your normal level of cognitive function. So chronic wasting disease is a really unique disease, and it's challenging to deal with. So there's several characteristics about chronic wasting disease that make it difficult to handle. Firstly, chronic wasting disease has a long incubation period, which makes the disease difficult to detect in early stages of infection. So based on research, minimum incubation periods, which means the time from the time of exposure to the time that the animal starts developing clinical symptoms, is approximately 16 to 18 months. And there's an average time of infection to death of about 23 months. So that's approximately 2 years that the animal could be infected and continuing to shed the disease, but not yet showing signs and not yet having succumbed to the disease. So most natural cases occur in 2 to 7 year old cervids. And it appears that prions are shed and the disease is progressing before the onset of clinical diseases in deer and elk. So basically, these animals are going to be, still having the disease and still capable of spreading the disease to other animals long before you ever notice that they're sick. This silent period can be problematic because early detection is critical in the management of wildlife disease. So chronic wasting disease makes that almost impossible by having that long silent period. So typically fawns and young deer, even though they are infected, they may not have any positive symptoms and they may not even test positively. So prions basically concentrate in lymphatic and nervous tissues, but they can also be found in other tissues and bodily fluids. So if you take a look at this diagram here, you can see the areas that are highlighted where there would be higher concentration of these misfolded prions. However, deer can also shed prions in their urine, feces, blood, saliva, and through nose-to-nose contact. Again, chronic wasting disease is a progressive and degenerative disease that is always fatal. So if deer live long enough to actually develop clinical symptoms after contracting chronic wasting disease, they'll exhibit some of these late stage symptoms, such as dramatic weight loss, loss of coordination, including stumbling movement, drooping head or ears, excessive salivation. behavioral changes such as lethargy, a lack of fear of humans, and a slow or complete lack of response to potential threats. So these are a couple of pictures of deer that look like they could be suffering from chronic wasting disease. Notice that these animals are not only just skinny, they're exceptionally skinny, almost emaciated. And you can see that here, this elk on the bottom photo is standing in the typical sawhorse stance. That's a stance that these animals are going to take when they're finding it hard to balance. These animals are also more likely to succumb to predators, car collisions, or hunters. Essentially, as their brain further deteriorates, they're less likely to be a normal deer. They're less likely to see people approaching or see predators or vehicles approaching and get out of the way. And they're more likely to stand there, therefore becoming more vulnerable to death that way. So next we'll look at a video of a deer that is positive for chronic wasting disease in the Panhandle. So you notice right off the bat, this deer has very shaggy pelt, doesn't quite look right, but as we watch the video, you'll see signs of that excessive salivation. So here you can see that the deer has kind of droopy ears. They're kind of not really acting right. They don't look fully alert or aware of the situation around them, and they are drooling excessively. So this animal was removed and tested positive for CWD. Here is another video of an animal that tested positive for chronic wasting disease in El Paso. This deer actually died roughly 10 minutes after the video was taken. So this is very late stage chronic wasting disease. And again, you'll notice excessive salivation and that the deer is just not responding to the situation at hand. You may also think that maybe this is just a photo. It's not a photo. If you have your volume turned up, you should be able to hear the background sounds going on here. So again, the deer is exhibiting almost a complete lack of response to potential threats, being dogs. The deer is very poor body condition and continuing to exhibit that excessive salivation. So this would be a deer that we would be very concerned may have chronic wasting disease, and obviously this animal died from the disease very shortly after. So if you see a deer that's behaving in this way, not fearful of humans, not fearful of potential threats, you definitely want to consider getting in touch with Texas Parks and Wildlife and letting us know that this may be a deer infected with chronic wasting disease. However, chronic wasting disease infected deer may appear healthy before developing any clinical symptoms. As we talked about just a few slides ago, due to that long silent period, that long incubation period that chronic wasting disease has in cervids, these deer can appear totally normal before beginning to exhibit clinical signs. So you may look at that buck on the left and say, man, he looks healthy. He looks like a good looking deer. And even that doe that's harvested there, she's a little thin, but she looks healthy to me. It's impossible to tell by visually inspecting the deer. They must be tested for chronic wasting disease in order for us to tell you whether or not the animals were positively carrying the disease. That's why it's important to follow critical carcass movement and disposal rules also when you're hunting in a known CWD area. So chronic wasting disease can be transmitted by a couple different ways. We'll talk about how deer transmit to one another and also into the environment. So deer can transmit chronic wasting disease through nose-to-nose contact. So here's some deer you can see, sniffing one another, typical deer behavior. They can exchange bodily fluids that way and contract chronic wasting disease from one another. But they can also contract chronic wasting disease from sniffing another deer's saliva, urine, feces, antler velvet, and other body tissues or fluids. Again, this is typical deer behavior that they'll definitely partake in sniffing or licking other deer and their bodily fluids in order to gain information about the other animals. So deer are definitely going to be more at risk just because they're somewhat social animals. However, they can also contract chronic wasting disease through contaminated environments. And the way that that happens is infected animals shed these prions into the environment. The prions can remain infectious in the environment for many years, but they can also bind to soil particles there in the environment, and they can also attach to or be taken up by plants, which are then eaten by deer. So you see these deer here at the feeder. If one of those deer is positive for chronic wasting disease and they urinate or defecate right there at that area, then that puts other deer that come to the feeder at risk for contracting and developing chronic wasting disease for years to come. So live animal movements and interactions are definitely a concern that we have for the spread of chronic wasting disease across the landscape. So they're going to be doing, whether that's natural movement or anthropogenic movement, where humans are moving live cervids. However, also improper disposal of carcass parts or carcass movements can also lead to the spread of chronic wasting disease across the landscape. So we'll talk more about proper carcass handling and disposal here a little later in the PowerPoint. While scavengers and predators may be thought to contribute to the spread of chronic wasting disease, that's pretty low probability. If an infected animal dies in an area where it typically ranges, the predators and scavengers are not typically going to pull that animal outside of an area that it's typically found in. So really that's not something that we think has a high probability of spreading chronic wasting disease. And prion uptake by plants, especially the movement of hay and feed product, is probably a low probability way for chronic wasting disease to spread across the landscape as well. So in summary, there are many, many ways that chronic wasting disease can be spread across the landscape. So you take a look at this fairly complex diagram here, there's a lot of different ways that chronic wasting disease can end up in a new environment. However, the most important things that we can handle as hunters or livestock or wildlife managers or land managers is anthropogenic spread and making sure that we try to limit anything that humans do to increase the spread of chronic wasting disease. So here's a map from the USGS in April of 2007 that shows the CWD prevalence in free-ranging populations and the CWD prevalence in captive breeding facilities. So you can see here in 2007 that there was no chronic wasting disease found in Texas. And in 2023, you can see that chronic wasting disease not only is found in Texas, but its range has increased in both number of detected facilities and just the spatial area of free-ranging populations across the United States and into Canada. So pretty broad coverage of chronic wasting disease out here in the United States. So why should we be concerned? If this is a disease that's, kind of been around for almost 20 years, what is it that we should be worried about? So first, we need to understand the population level impacts on the deer herd. Chronic wasting disease infected deer are going to be more likely to die from predators, vehicles, and hunters. As we talked about before, the development of that spongiform pathology in the brain makes these deer more likely to be killed by something that may have occurred naturally, but they're going to be at a much higher risk for that occurring to them at that point. Chronic wasting disease deaths can often exceed natural rates of mortality and reduce survival of adult females, therefore decreasing population growth. So if you take a look at this chart here, it actually shows that deer that were positive for chronic wasting disease have deer that are positive for chronic wasting disease have a much higher rate of death, a much lower survival probability than deer that are not positive for chronic wasting disease. And you can see that both positive and negative animals take a dip in their survivability during the gun and bow season, obviously, because there's hunters out on the landscape. However, deer that are positive for chronic wasting disease take a much sharper dip in their survival probability. So that's something that we need to be aware of when we're trying to manage deer herds in CWD susceptible areas. There's also impacts on hunting and hunter participation. So as there's decreased deer numbers potentially available out there on the landscape, there's also decreased hunting opportunity. And as there is a younger age structure within the herd, seeing as more mature bucks are going to be the ones that have gotten through that silent period, those are going to be the more mature deer are going to be the ones that are more affected by clinical symptoms of chronic wasting disease. We're going to have a younger age structure within our deer populations, which means there are decreased mature bucks, which means there's decreased trophy quality deer. So this also affects economic portions of hunting. So hunting related businesses may suffer, right? If you have less mature bucks that are available for hunting on the landscape, there's going to be less hunters drawn to that area. Real estate value may also be affected, especially if you are now in a CWD containment or surveillance zone. That kind of affects people's mindsets on harvesting wildlife and eating deer meat from that area. We'll also have changes in wildlife agency funding. If there's projects aimed at increasing the deer population, in a CWD prevalent zone, we don't really want to increase the deer populations. We're just going to increase the ability for deer to spread the disease. And again, hunting and wildlife tourism will be impacted because there's going to be less hunters or less wildlife enthusiasts potentially traveling to that area as the disease reduces the number of deer. So chronic wasting disease has, many management challenges. Firstly, there's no cure or vaccine. So Texas Parks and Wildlife is not aware of any way that deer can be cured once they have chronic wasting disease. It's going to be 100% fatal. They're either going to die from clinical symptoms of chronic wasting disease, or while they're developing those clinical symptoms and suffering from the decreased cognitive ability, they're going to die from a natural cause, mostly because of their decreased cognitive function. Chronic wasting disease prions are resistant to disinfection, and they're also persistent within the environment. So it's difficult for us to go and ensure that a place where deer have been that have had chronic wasting disease have existed is going to be safe for new deer to come back into the area. There's no rapid diagnostic test available for chronic wasting disease, so it's almost impossible for us to again tell if a deer is positive for chronic wasting disease. The most commonly used test for chronic wasting disease is a post-mortem test that we do typically on hunter harvested or road killed deer. So a live test is in the works. However, there's no rapid diagnostic test. So it's not like you can swab a deer like a COVID test and know in 15 to 30 minutes whether or not that animal is positive for CWD. CWD is often a focal disease and is very slow spreading. So it's difficult to contain the disease because once it's in an area, it takes a while for it to be detected. And at that time, due to the silent period, the disease has already been spreading for a couple of years. So eradication of chronic wasting disease is almost impossible. At this point, we are really trying to mitigate the impacts of chronic wasting disease on our wild deer herds. So our CWD management options include managing live animal movements. If we can reduce the movements of live animals, be that anthropogenic or natural movements, we're reducing the opportunity for deer from one area to spread CWD to deer in another area. We can also manage carcass movements, again, because we talked about how CWD positive deer are more likely to be harvested by hunters. We know that we don't want to have those hunter harvested carcasses moving from a CWD positive area to a area that hasn't yet been exposed to CWD. We can also manage deer densities, as we talked about deer spreading the disease via nose-to-nose contact. If there are less deer in an area, there's going to be less potential transmission opportunities, especially from direct animal-to-animal contact. And finally, we can manage those positive captive facilities where CWD has been detected in captive herds. So we'll talk a little bit more about our CWD management plan later on in the presentation. But next, I want to talk to you guys about how hunters can help out with chronic wasting disease spread. So we have some general precautions for our hunters. Firstly, it's important to know that there's no strong evidence that chronic wasting disease is transmissible to humans. However, in the absence of complete information on risk and in light of similarities to other animal and human TSEs, public health officials and wildlife management professionals recommend that hunters harvesting deer and elk in affected areas should take common sense measures to avoid chronic wasting disease and spread. So we as a department recommend that you don't eat a deer that's sick with anything. So if you harvest a deer from a chronic wasting disease area, we are actually able to test your deer for you. And we have a relatively quick turnaround time, typically less than 5 weeks. So you can take your deer, you can have it processed, you can put it in your freezer and check back with Texas Parks and Wildlife to determine whether or not your animal was positive for chronic wasting disease before you decide to eat it. Additionally, when you are processing your deer, we recommend that you wear gloves, be those, regular rubber or latex gloves. We recommend that you remove as much fat and connective tissue from the meat that you'd like to take home as possible. We ask that you quarter your deer in the field. Don't take the deer back to your house and do it in your garage or take the deer to a completely different location. We recommend that you keep the deer on the property where it was harvested in order to field dress it. And then you can take your quarters out of the surveillance or containment zone. We also recommend that you leave internal organs and inedible parts at the site of harvest if possible, or you can bury those or dispose of them in an approved landfill. So that brings us to our next point on carcass disposal. So in order to minimize the risk of spreading the disease through infected carcass parts and contaminating the environment, hunters or people who are receiving deer meat should follow recommended disposal practices. So again, we ask, if possible, to please leave the carcass parts on the site where the animal was harvested. If the animal has been obviously frequenting that area, has lived there, it makes the most sense to leave those carcass parts in an area that's already been exposed to whatever pathogens the animal that you shot had. However, if you need to, you can also dispose of carcass parts in a trash can that will be taken to a type 1 landfill. And why is that important? So this map here represents the zip code of hunters that harvested a deer within the core area of Wisconsin with the highest prevalence of chronic wasting disease, which is 55% of their deer have of their adult bucks have chronic wasting disease, and 30% of their adult does have chronic wasting disease. So if you think about that and look over here, in Wisconsin, see how far those hunters have could have potentially taken meat or trophy products from that harvested animal. And there's about a 50% shot that that animal was positive for chronic wasting disease. So we really need to be cognizant of where we take deer parts, especially from areas where we know chronic wasting disease occurs. All right, so chronic wasting disease was first detected in Texas in 2012 in far west Texas in a free-ranging mule deer population along the border of Texas and New Mexico near the Waco Mountains. So CWD has since been detected in Texas captive and free-ranging cervids, including whitetail deer, mule deer, red deer, and elk. So basically, after chronic wasting disease was found in Texas, TPWD created CWD surveillance and containment zones in order to further monitor for chronic wasting disease, as well as prevent the further spread of the disease. Texas Parks and Wildlife also worked with the Texas Animal Health Commission to develop a disease management plan, and chronic wasting disease testing continues statewide. So the chronic wasting disease management plan goals are to minimize CWD risk to free-ranging and captive white-tailed deer, mule deer, and other cervid species, to establish and maintain support for prudent CWD management with hunters, landowners, and other stakeholders, to minimize direct and indirect impact of chronic wasting disease to hunting-related economies, and conservation in Texas. So notice that our CWD management plan doesn't say eradicate CWD. We realize that that is most likely impossible. However, we want to ensure that we're able to minimize CWD risks and minimize CWD impacts across the state. So Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists are asked every year to go out and sample as many deer as we can from our assigned counties. So you can see here between 2012 and 2022, 127,000 CWD samples have been submitted. So this map just shows all the different CWD samples across the state. Notice that most of them are going to be from roadkill deer. You can see those highways really pop out on this map. But many of them are also from hunter harvested animals. So there's 25 counties where chronic wasting disease has been detected from 2012 through 2023. And here you can see the different counties in which chronic wasting disease has been detected and how many deer have been positively identified with chronic wasting disease in that area. So notice that even though in far west Texas, where chronic wasting disease was originally located, there's relatively low numbers of chronic wasting disease detected out there in that region. So with those chronic wasting disease detections, Texas Parks and Wildlife created these chronic wasting disease containment and surveillance zones. The containment zones are highlighted here in red, and the containment zones are areas that there has been higher chronic wasting disease detection. And so that's an area where Parks and Wildlife tries to manage chronic wasting disease risk more strongly. And the surveillance zone is highlighted there in yellow. Those are intended to be a bit of a buffer zone where we still want to be able to sample wild and hunter harvested and road-killed deer to ensure that the disease is not spreading. So there are 16 new CWD positive detections between March 2023 and today. So if you hunt in a chronic wasting disease zone, be it a containment zone or a surveillance zone, there's a couple of different rules that we ask our hunters to abide by. So the first is mandatory testing of chronic wasting disease susceptible animals. Hunter harvested animals must be tested within 48 hours of harvest, and that can be done either by an approved CWD sample collector, or you can bring it to one of our CWD check stations. Susceptible species include white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, red deer, and sika deer. Also, we ask hunters to abide by our mandatory carcass movement restrictions. So this means that your deer must be quartered with no brain or spinal tissue attached in order to leave the zone. So you can take things out like deboned meat. You can take out your quarters. You can take out a skull cap. So if you're able to remove the antlers with the base of the skull attached, you can do that as long as you have removed all brain and spinal tissue from that. However, if you'd like to take out a whole deer head with brain and spinal tissue still in there, you will actually have to obtain a head waiver from Texas Parks and Wildlife staff, and that will allow you to transport your trophy outside of the zone to a taxidermist. And that head waiver will inform the taxidermist of how he needs to treat the extra carcass parts when he's handling this deer because it came from a containment or surveillance zone. And again, movement of live deer is restricted. and Texas Parks and Wildlife reviews movement of live deer statewide in light of chronic wasting disease risks. So if you harvest a deer and you're heading to a chronic wasting disease check station, what can you expect? Well, first, a biologist is going to want to collect a sample from your harvested animal. You can either bring the entire carcass or just the head. We will either collect the retropharyngeal lymph nodes or the obex. The retropharyngeal lymph nodes are about right here, just behind your jaw and behind your voice box. So approximately where the white spot on a deer's neck ends is going to be where we would ask you to go ahead and remove that head and bring that all to us so that we can collect the retropharyngeal lymph nodes. If you have a trophy deer or a deer that you would like to do a shoulder mount on, we can collect the obex, which is basically the brain stem. And what we'll do with that is we'll make a Y cut from the back of the antlers and down the neck away, which is a similar cut to what a taxidermist would make when they are caping out your deer. All right, so on top of the biological samples, we also need to get a little bit of information from you, the hunter. So we'll ask for the harvest location. We'll need your help finding a GPS point on the map where you harvested this deer. We'll want to know your name, your contact information, and the name of the ranch where you harvested the animal. We're also curious to know whether or not the ranch is involved in our MLDP program, which you should know based on the tag that you're using. And then your biologist will go ahead and estimate the age of the deer, and they'll also take baseline antler measurements from a buck if you were to bring him in. Also, many Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists are certified Texas Big Game Award scorers, and we actually can score your deer for you if you would like. So when you're leaving the check station, you'll receive a receipt card that's going to look just like this one here on the top left. So your receipt card is gonna basically be your proof of sex. So if you bring us an antlerless deer, you can actually leave the head with us and you can keep this card as your proof of sex. It's also going to be your proof that you came to a chronic wasting disease testing area and you allowed us to collect a sample from your harvested animal. That's going to be very important if you're trying to leave a containment or surveillance zone. So that'll be the front of your card. On the back of your card, you'll have a barcode that looks just like the one on the bottom left there. So you can take that barcode and go to the website listed on the front, type in your barcode number, and within about 3 to 4 weeks, you'll be able to see right there on the website whether or not your animal tested positive for chronic wasting disease. A lot of hunters will wait until they can see the results of their test before they decide to eat the meat. A lot of them will go ahead and just get it processed and just keep it in their freezer until they can see their test results. If you are trying to bring a trophy animal out of the containment or surveillance zone, we'll also issue you a head waiver. And again, that's just going to be information that will be handed to the taxidermist when you get the animal to that processing destination. So how can hunters or wildlife enthusiasts, landowners, or the general public help us out with preventing the spread of chronic wasting disease? So first, we ask you to stay informed about chronic wasting disease in Texas. You can visit this website. You can just search TPWD CWD. That'll be the first website that comes up on Google, or you can type this website into your browser. On this page is where we will release notifications about chronic wasting disease, new rules relevant to chronic wasting disease. You can also access educational documents and videos that will help you learn more about chronic wasting disease. We also ask that you report deer that appear sick to your Texas Parks and Wildlife biologist or game wardens. If you notice a deer that is incredibly thin or has excessive salivating like we saw in those earlier videos, or a deer that just seems off for some reason, we ask that you please get in touch with a TPWD representative so that we can go out there and ensure that that deer is not spreading CWD on the landscape. We also ask that you adhere to proper disposal of carcass parts, as we've already covered. You know, it's very important to make sure that if hunters are harvesting deer that could potentially be infected with chronic wasting disease, that they don't take that to a new area and infect a new environment. And further, we ask that you provide as many samples as you would like to Texas Parks and Wildlife. Us biologists spend a good portion of deer season out there trying to collect as many chronic wasting disease samples as we can from road-killed deer. However, if there are hunter-harvested deer, that really helps us get a better understanding of the deer health, the herd health outside of just those highway, areas. All right, so that is about all I had to share with y'all on chronic wasting disease. This QR code here will allow you to find your Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists. So go ahead and take a snapshot of this page, and you'll be able to refer to that whenever you need to reach your biologist. And again, here is the page for our chronic wasting disease information website listed right there. So my name is Rachel, and even though I'm your Presidio County biologist, I would be happy to help any of y'all with any questions that you have about chronic wasting disease, regardless of what county you're from.
Thank you, Rachel. Everybody that has any questions, you can unmute if there's anything specific that you would like to ask at this time.
Actually, I do have some questions.
Yes, ma'am.
This is Ethel Matthews. Okay, your samples you're going to be testing, you're going to be taking tissue samples and you see the plaques or the whatever with under the microscope, just regular microscope?
Theoretically, you could, but that's not how we conduct the test. We actually collect the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, typically that are right here, kind of in your neck. The same thing that if you go to the doctor and you complain about having a cold or flu, they'll kind of push on your neck. And the Obex as well. Those both get sent off to the Texas A&M testing lab there in College Station, and they run the test for us. So Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists are not capable of doing the tests on the spot.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions?
Yes, I've got 2 or 3.
It's
still Ethel.
Keep going, Ethel. You're good.
I didn't want to take the stage entirely. Is there much concern for transmission of chronic wasting disease to, say, predators or pets?
Yeah, so there hasn't been evidence of that occurring. However, that's a really difficult research question to answer. So at this time, no, there is no concern. There's low concern for that to occur. It seems most likely that other cervid species that come across a road-killed or predated carcass that may be infected by chronic wasting disease, those other cervids are going to be able to contract chronic wasting disease, but there's not a lot of evidence that cats, coyotes, other predators are going to contract chronic wasting disease from that. Now, they may pick up some meat and run a little ways with it, like coyotes do, or a lion may cache it in a nearby tree or something, but I wouldn't suspect that they'll contract chronic wasting disease.
Okay. And then one last question, and then I'll hush. You know that video of that deer that was salivating, drooling? What would you do to clean up? That was right in somebody's driveway. It looked like their front door. What would you suggest to clean up and make sure that that was not going to be a problem of whatever sort? I don't expect other deer to come to the door, but it was just a curiosity if those prions are so difficult to eradicate.
Right, yeah. And when it's in porous surfaces like that, such as dirt or concrete, it's unlikely that you'll probably ever be able to clean it up appropriately. However, when Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists work and we're touching contaminated surfaces or touching contaminated animals, we try to ensure that we're using non-porous surfaces, so like plastic tarp and things like that. will be able to clean with bleach. So we do use a bleach solution to clean those types of surfaces. However, like I said, because it's concrete, I'm not sure that you would ever be able to accomplish that. But my best recommendation would be to apply a water bleach mixture to the area.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.
Well, yes, ma'am. Thank you for listening in and thank you for your questions.
Is there any other questions that we have from anybody? I think Ethel kind of got most of the ones that I had. So, and I think you covered this. Anything that's like changing and all those things,
Sorry,
they
Brady.
can go. No, you're good. You're good. No, that's that. I'm glad you asked those. Updates and changes to areas and things like that. Is that all easily accessed on the website?
Right. Yeah, that's all going to be easily accessed on the website. If there's going to be new CWD detections, there's typically a public notification issued through that website. Also, if there's going to be new containment zones or surveillance zones established across the state, they'll be listed in your outdoor annual. They'll also be listed there on the website. Additionally, if there's other CWD detections, Texas Parks and Wildlife does typically issue those, on the website. So anything that y'all need to know, go ahead and take a look at that CWD webpage. You'll be able to find as much information as Parks and Wildlife can provide to you. It's all going to be available there.
I did have one. So I know that there's not a lot of research on this jumping from species to species. The information on that is kind of all over the place. Is there any specific research going on, however, about CWD being transmitted to not necessarily humans, but the sheep and goats that they're around, or cattle, or things like that?
So as far as sheep and goats and cattle, I'm not particularly certain about research going on, CWD transmission between wildlife species like that. It is chronic wasting disease is very, very similar to other TSEs that do occur in livestock. There have been some clinical research studies where chronic wasting disease was chronic wasting disease was attempted to be given to non-cervid species. So animals like Rhesus macaques, those little monkeys, were used as something more similar to human primates, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those animals were fed CWD infected meat, and they were even injected with CWD prions. And it was determined through the results of that study that in a natural setting, a human eating an infected deer and not injecting themselves with prions, that it was highly unlikely that humans would be able to contract chronic wasting disease. There have also been studies with in a natural setting where they've had infected native deer and non-infected axis deer, and to my knowledge, they weren't able to get the axis deer to contract chronic wasting disease, or if they did contract it, it was a very low prevalence. So it appears that some cervid species are more resistant to contracting chronic wasting disease than our native species are.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll say this: anybody that's interested in looking at this, looking at some of those other ones like scrapies and mad cow disease, might be something that if you're really interested in it and concerned about it, there's a lot of research on that side of things too. So
for sure, yeah.
Okay, with that, I think we're gonna hopefully have this all recorded, and I'm gonna be able to put it on the website. And thank you, Rachael, very much for your presentation, and all of our participants for jumping on too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brady. It was nice to be able to chat with y'all today. And if you have any other questions about chronic wasting disease, how to contact your biologist or your game warden, my email and my cell phone number are listed right here on this page. So feel free to shoot me an email, send me a text, or give me a call, and I'll help you out as best I can.
Thank you, Rachel.